Welcome to the Humans of Hospitality podcast. I know so many of you listening to this show love your local bar, your local restaurant, maybe your local hotel, and have so many fond memories of time in hospitality businesses. This is the podcast where we get to chat to the human beings behind the scenes of that industry. Maybe the chefs or the bakers or the coffee roasters or the gin distillers or the craft brewers or the entrepreneurs, but all doing an amazing job of making sure that hospitality stays interesting and the big, dull, formulaic brands do not take over our high street. Please enjoy the show. In this week's conversation, I am chatting to Michael Stoates, who is a fifth generation miller in Dorset, whose family have been producing stone ground flour ever since 1832, the era when sailing ketches would carry the flour across the Severn to Swansea and return with coal for the mills. We actually got to enjoy this conversation on the edge of the river where there has been a mill for over 1,000 years. Now, as a teenager, Michael thought he'd be an engineer, but he had so much fun getting his hands dirty in the holidays he couldn't help but join the family business. And in this conversation, you're going to learn about the wonder of the wheat germ, the very embryo of life, which gives bread its gorgeous flavour, and what really happens to it in modern mechanised milling. And you'll get to see how Michael has adapted to this ever-changing bread scene, from the lows of the 80s and the 90s when his whole food shop market completely disappeared, to the much brighter times now with our growing interest in continental breads, artisanal baking and sourdough. I very much hope you enjoy this week's conversation. Michael, thank you so much for sparing the time and welcoming me to your mill. Can you just tell me where in the world am I? I've just driven through miles of countryside. Where are we? Can you just describe our environment?
Right, we're in the village of Cannes, which is at the bottom of the hill outside the Saxon hilltop town of Shaftesbury, which is famous for its Gold Hill, of course, with the old Yorkshireman pushing his bicycle up the hill with his loaves of bread.
Yeah.
So it's quite apt that what we're doing here today is sort of grinding flour to make bread.
So there's always been a bread and baking link. And you're literally tucked into are we at the bottom of the valley here? I seem to see, I came down a hill, turned a sharp right, and all of a sudden I was here.
That's right. No, we're at the bottom of the hill, and hence the reason for the mill being here along the source of the Sterkel, which is feeds the Stour further on. So there used to be 5 mills within a mile on this stretch of the river. Wow. So it follows the way. It comes out of the chalk about half a mile up the river, and then the springs come out and they follow the course down. So we're the only mill remaining now. But there's one mill above us that's still got all the machinery there, but all the others are house conversions.
Really? So how long has there been a mill on this location?
Difficult to say exactly, but certainly 1,000 years. There's one recorded in the Domesday Book. Yes, a mill at Cannes. So whether it's exactly where the mill is today or whether it's sort of a few hundred
That's
feet
incredible.
away.
1,000 years of milling history, and that's specifically then because of its location on the water and the flow of the water makes it a good...
Yes, no, it was a very consistent supply of water, even in 1976 when we had the dry weather then, and for that matter last summer. Really? It didn't make any difference to the capacity we could mill. We build up the head of water in a mill pond. That builds up, it's a bit like recharging your battery at night, really. We use the water during the day, shut the sluices, and it builds up overnight. So as long as the mill pond's full by the morning,
Right. I'm getting a bit geeky now, but where does that water? How is it not affected by rainfall and dry summers? So where's that water coming from? It's a spring.
It comes out of the springs,
right.
And the springs come out of the chalk, and possibly because the chalk is a very deep springs, and it wasn't affected by the dry weather. So it's, no, they tend to be really consistent.
Yeah, amazing. So 5th generation, I think I read. You just explained the history. How long have you been here, and how long has it been in the family?
My father moved here in 1947. His father milled before that in Bristol. That was a fairly big modern mill at the time. And then before that we're in Watchet in Somerset. So that's where it all started, milling in watch it. It was producing flour. That was going through the Industrial Revolution. Then it was that 1832 that started. So that was a stone mill initially, and then it went over to the roller milling system. There was the coal milling industry was being developed in Swansea, so there was a huge demand for flour over in Swansea. So they'd mill it and watch it, and they had 2 sailing ketches that would take the flour over to Swansea to meet the demand, and then they'd come back with coal, which latterly drove the steam turbine that ran the mill. So it was a full cycle there. And then they outgrew that premises, so that's when the new mill was built in Bristol. And then Spillers took over the business in the 1930s. But my father carried on work. He started working for the family business, and then the war broke out. So he was away for 5 years during the war. He was in the Navy. He came back and worked 2 years for Spillers, and then decided he wanted to be out on his own. So he purchased this can mills. So this was an animal feed mill when he first arrived. So it wasn't producing flour at all. Right. So it was producing a meal mainly for dairy farmers and pig farmers in the area. And then so that was in 1947. So it wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that we started going back to our roots of producing flour.
Okay. And you were saying earlier that the original building that was here actually burnt down in the 1950s.
That's right. When he came here, the building was built out of local stone and wooden framed. And sadly, in 1954, it burnt to the ground. Probably a diesel engine that a manifold overheated, and Hessian sacks, and so a whole lot went up. Yeah. So we've been rebuilt out of industrial materials of the day, which was sort of concrete then. It was what they call a reamer building. So it was a prefab building that was put up. Within a year, he was up and running again, wow. Which was pretty good for those days. So it's a very practical building now. It's big, heavy concrete beams and 3-metre ceilings. So it's fairly bomb-proof. We can do what we want in it, really. Yeah. Whereas
fit for purpose. So did you live here as a child then?
I grew up here. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And was it sort of insistent you must be a miller, or were you going to go off and do something else?
It's one doesn't know what was going on behind the scenes. But,
you were being brainwashed. Yeah.
My brother, he'd gone into ornithology and nature and studying environmental studies, really. Yes, whether the more pressure was put on me, I don't know, but I tended to be more interested in the engineering side of things. So I got bored at school, and so left a bit early and went on and did an engineering course in Salisbury, thinking I was going to go and carry on with that in Oxford with some friends who had gone up. But I enjoyed the practical side of things back here at the mill. During the holidays, I'd come and help, and like tinkering around with the machinery and getting hands dirty and producing a product at the end of the day too. It was found it very satisfying. So yes, I gradually moulded into the milling scene here, and never looked back really. And it's a hugely satisfying.
So you sort of evolved. It wasn't a eureka moment. You said, "Yeah, that's it. I'm going to dedicate my life to this." It just sort of happened.
It did evolve.
And here you are.
Yes, I believe my grandfather. He was told that he had to be a miller, and he said, "No, I want to be a farmer." "No, you're going to be a miller." And it wasn't until he retired that he became a farmer.
That's patience.
A long time. Yeah. But. No, I've
what are you going to do when you grow up?
I don't know. I haven't grown
up. You're fairly committed now, I think.
I'd like to do more bread making, actually. One thing I miss, because it's so involved in the mill, that I wish I had more time for actually making bread. So it'd be nice to spend a bit more time doing that.
And then you've got kids as well, have you? Or?
I've got a son and a daughter and a stepson. Yeah, so my son now, he's joined me in the business.
Has he? Okay.
Yes, he's been Oliver. He's been here for nearly 3 years now.
Right.
Daughter, she's reading product design at Loughborough. So
okay.
Bit of engineering still in there.
Perfect. Okay, so there could be another evolution of the mill. So that's good. Yeah, I think it's different with these multi-generational businesses. And I just I did another podcast with a girl called Kerry, who was a 5th generation dairy farmer, and didn't think she was going to go into farming, sort of went into teaching, and now has actually taken over the farm. And that, although she loves it, I think it's a huge amount of responsibility when something's been multi-generational, isn't it? And I'm sure you're the same. You don't want your kids to do it out of obligation.
No, not at all.
But it must also be really rewarding if they genuinely love it and it creates an opportunity. And
yes, you can't deny that that's deep down what you want.
Yeah.
It's only human nature, but on the other hand, you want the most important things to be happy and
Absolutely.
for them to do what they want to do. So when Ollie was younger, I said, fancy, what do you think? And he said, no. I suppose he used to watch me work so hard, long hours, and think, well, it's the last thing I'm going to do.
Yeah, you work so hard. Yeah.
And then I think as he sort of grew up, he realised that, you've got to get your teeth stuck into something, and you see that it was, just the hands-on.
Yeah, it's got to be better than working in a bank, hasn't it? I mean,
Ollie's very hands-on. He likes doing things practically and things. So, you can see he's enjoying it more and more.
Excellent. So you've got a reputation for amazing produce, and thanks for the tour. You've just shown me around, so I'm learning so much. But a lot of that comes from the way that you mill, and then it's the traditional kind of stone ground. So can you just explain a little bit about the mill here and what's special about it compared to how so much flour is made nowadays?
Yeah, we try and keep the process as simple as possible. Really, it is the traditional stone ground flour. And we don't tamper with that in any way. We use most of the stones we have are natural, the French burr millstone, which is a primitive limestone. We've got two composite stones, which are Danish stones. But the actual principle of milling we keep as simple as we possibly can. We don't add anything to the grain. We mill it and make the white flour by sieving it, mechanical sieving. So yes, we like to think that it's as natural as possible. It's tampered with as little as possible, and it is a natural product. Modern roller milling, modern milling, it's all done on steel rollers, and it's very scientifically done to produce as much flour as white flour as possible from the grain. So there's a lot of high-tech separation, not just with air classification, separating the starch from the fibre. So it's called a gradual reduction process. So it'll go through several sets of rolls, each time breaking the grain up into different fractions. So at the end of the line, you've got all these different products that they've got from the grain, and then depending on what product they're marketing, they feed them back together again. So for wholemeal flour, they'll put most of it ends up going back together again. For the whitest of white flour, they'll just choose the bits of endosperm that come from the very centre of the grain, so there's nothing from the outside at all in it.
Okay.
And then there'll be fractions in between, depending on, like a standard bread flour will have certain amounts of the white flour that are closest to the outside layer. So it's very scientific and very very efficient, but it doesn't have the same flavour as a stone ground flour. I mean, it doesn't have the wheat germ in it. This gets taken out, and wheat germ, although constitutes only 1.5% of the grain, it's the embryo of life. It's where all the natural oils are in the grain that produces the germination, and this is where a lot of flavour and goodness is. But because it's high in oil, and oil goes rancid, in the interests of long shelf life, it's often removed from the flour. With the stone ground flour, you just can't take it out. It's ground in the flour, and the natural warmth in the process of milling makes the oil more runny, and as it gets ground between the stones, it gets rubbed in. So even the stone ground white flour will have the goodness of the wheat germ oils in there, and that's why you get that pale yellow colour to the flour, because it's got all this goodness still left in there. Okay,
so that's where the nutrition is, in essence. That's the seed. That's where, like you said, that's where life comes from. So take that out, and what have you got? What's the bit the rest of us are eating?
I mean, and the centre of the grain is starch. I mean, so yes, it's white and fluffy and not a lot of flavour. Right. But as you get closer to the outside layer of the grain, you come across more of the nutrients, more of the flavours, more of the goodness. So obviously there's a balance here of economics and character to the flour.
It seems crazy that we take out so much and end up with a product that's doesn't taste as nice and has less nutritional kind of goodness in it. And it seems odd that we do that, doesn't it? But when did that start? When did we get this obsession with modern flour without the nutrition?
Well, probably longer ago than a lot of people think. Actually, it was a bit of a status to be able to eat white bread. The whiter the bread was the better you were if you could eat white bread. So and this created a huge demand for white flour, which the stone mills dotted around the country couldn't keep up with. So this new technology, as it was, came in this 1850s from Hungary, and it was because they could produce so much more white flour per hour and more efficiently. And so a lot of some stone mills just stopped trading. Others embraced the technology and installed roller milling equipment into the stone mills, which was quite a challenge. And if you look in the history books in the late 1800s, so 1880 to 1900, a huge amount of mill fires. And it's because all this high output technology was being crammed into old rickety buildings, and the technology was quite infinite, I suppose. So the bearings and things would be overheating, and there'd be dust around that would ignite. So there's a lot of mills that burnt down during that period.
Okay.
But the technology has moved on, and modern roller milling has sort of proved to be this hugely efficient industry at producing white flour efficiently.
Right, predominantly from a yield perspective, so basically they can get more flour out of the grain.
More flour out of the grain is all about extraction rates.
Right.
Yeah, so
as has a lot of farming become much more industrialised, the pressure on dairy farms and milk at a certain price and all that kind of stuff. So
that's right.
Just across the industry. So we're lucky that people, like you, are there still a lot of mills doing it the traditional way across the country, or has this become quite niche?
I think there are more and more. There's we're a member of the Traditional Corn Millers Guild, so it's a guild that started over 25 years ago now, I think, and it's there's over must be heading on towards 30 members now. Small mills dotted around the country. Some are just working museums, but have good volunteer support and take the craft seriously. There's quite passionate about it. So the dotted around the country, there are quite a few mills sort of producing, but it's very low volumes.
Right. So the percentage of flour produced in this way is what, less than one?
A fraction of one.
Really?
A fraction of a percent. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's,
okay.
I think the whole milling industry is about 5 million tons a year in this country. It's quite a lot of grain being milled.
Amazing.
But the the actual small mills will be a fraction of a percent.
Right. So whereas organic, I think it's grown now, but it was 3% at one stage. So you're even less than that. So where there seems to be this growth in sort of people's desire for nutrition and some of the artisan breads and stuff like that, how do we fulfill that now then? Because can those modern mills produce the flour that you do, or are we going to need to see a growth if we want to kind of go back on this trajectory of actual nutritious bread and getting back to the grains? Are we going to need to build more traditional mills? Or?
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. Can you get bigger? That's the 1%. How are you going to get you to 10%? You're going to need.
That would be a lovely thought, because a lot of villages were built on a watercourse, and the first building that went up would have been the mill, because that was the only source of power at the time. And so if these can be brought back into life, and milling flour on a local basis using local grain from the local farmer and just supplying with very few food miles, that's it'd make a great story, and it'd be brilliant, but in reality I don't know how practical that would be.
Right, because it's happening in coffee roasters. So I interviewed a coffee roaster recently, Joel at Bad Hand, and we were chatting about the fact that there used to be a coffee roasters in every town, and your coffee would be roasted locally, and there might be two, and you'd either like that guy's or that guy's kind of coffee roast, and that was your choice. And then we're seeing a growth in the kind of artisan gins. So Rupert from Conquer Gin, for example, doing a lot more gins. Craft beer, Steve from 8 Arch we interviewed, and we lost all of the craft breweries and they all got swallowed up by the big guys, but now there's a lot more breweries locally. Is that not happening in milling world? Has the demand changed, or is the demand still dropping off for your style of flour?
No, I'd say it's increasing.
It is.
And the not just with the baker, I think with the home baker as well. I think people, I don't know if we can thank the British Bake Off for part of that. It certainly helped. It's got people interested in baking at home. We've noticed our sales, the retail bags increased over the last few years, and so there's been quite a following on sourdoughs. People, I suppose when the bread machine came in, whenever it did come in the 80s, it was a bit like the yogurt making, and a lot of people would have one, be given one, and use it initially for the first 3 weeks, and then it would get chucked in the back of the cupboard and sort of not used. Yeah. But there's a percentage of people who thought, oh yeah, this making bread's quite fun. I want to take it to the next stage and sort of make it properly and make sourdoughs. And the bread machines whetted their appetite and they've wanted to take it further. So I mean, okay, it's only a small percentage of the people with bread machines, but it has definitely got a lot more people interested in making bread that probably wouldn't have done before. And there's huge following on sourdoughs now, and people sort of competing with each other on a domestic level, just trying to produce the perfect loaf. So I think that's certainly helped create more interest in it and more demand, and people like then to go and buy the local flour rather than just go to the supermarket and just get a box standard flour off the shelf, which yes will make a nice sourdough, but at the end of the day you won't get the same depth of flavour or the same character to the loaf as you would if you're using a local flour.
So when I go to the supermarket now and I might see, I like nice bread, and you see the finest or best of or whatever the premium kind of brand is, which is very much being sold around being kind of, wholemeal and multi-grain and much more nutritious. Is that rubbish? Are they not actually using the kind of traditional flour with all the nutrition in because they simply wouldn't be able to because there's not enough supply?
I think the type of grain they use initially is going to have an impact on, like anything, I suppose. Well, what you put in is what you get out. So if you're using, for want of a better word, cheap grain from a big agriculture, you're not going to get the same result as if you're going to a small organic farmer who's putting a lot of passion into what they're growing. It's on a mixed farm. The yield is much less per acre. So you tend to get more intensity of flavour. A lot of the grain on the market, the high protein grain, is grown on very extensive system. So it comes in from Eastern Europe, from the Grain Basin, or from Canada, thousands of acres, only producing probably less than a tonne an acre. But the inputs are very low, and you tend not to get the flavour. It's a short growing season too, so you don't get the flavour developed through the growing season. Whereas in this country, the growing season tends to be longer.
Right.
And yes, you certainly get more flavour from locally grown grain.
Okay. So would most of the flour, whether it's good flour or not so good, with the nutrition removed, is most of it in the UK from the UK, or is it most of it an imported product now?
It's more from the UK.
Yeah.
Even the industrial mills will be using more UK grain than they would have done 10 years ago.
Why?
It's the varieties have got more suitable for bread making. As our expectations of what a loaf should look like, because if you go back 100 years ago, a loaf of bread would have been quite flat, heavy, and brick-like. But now, we like if it's a sourdough, we like all the holy bits and the airy bits, and even if it's a mass-produced supermarket loaf, people have that expectation of softness to the loaf, and that's developed over years of breeding the wheat varieties to produce what the end consumer wants at the end of the day. But they tend to breed them for commercial gain rather than necessarily the pleasure of eating it. So they'll grow it for high yield for the farmer, disease resistance, so they don't have to use so many sprays. They'll breed it so it has a good extraction rate. So for the miller, he's getting as much white flour out as he possibly can, and they'll breed it for the baker, so it has good water absorption, so they can add as much water as they can and produce as much dough out of a ton of flour. So you've got all these pointers that all led by money at the end of the day, and there's people like you and I sitting here, but what about the flavour? Where are we breeding it for that?
Nutrition,
and that's probably where everything's going a bit off course at the moment. And so we are seeing these heritage grains coming on the being talked about, and more some smaller organic farmers are growing more interesting grains. So to say we've done a full circle might be a bit extreme, but certainly we're looking back into the past and thinking, what can we take from there that's going to benefit the flavour of the bread.
Interesting. And then, so not only have you got the difference in how you actually, mill the flour and using the stones and keeping the wheat germ in, but actually the grain that you buy as well, you're 95% organic. Is that right? And why is that important?
Yes, most of what we do is organic now. I've still got a few customers who choose to have the non-organic grain. I mean, how we treat the grain and mill the flour is exactly the same. There's no difference at all. But it's just the way the grain has been grown from the organic system. There's no artificial fertilizers, insecticides, or herbicides. And that's the certification you get to prove that sort of thing, that it hasn't been tampered with it anyway. But the non-organic grain we use too is, we're careful about what farms we get it from, and we treat it in exactly the same way. So as far as I'm concerned, they're very similar products, really.
Yeah. And is your motivation for organic, is that to do with the flavour of the end product, or is that to do with how we farm and how we treat the land, or is it all of the above?
I think it is as a big picture, really. I don't think I could say it's just for flavour, because I think you could probably get that flavour too from a traditionally run British local farm, who are milling in a traditional rotation on a mixed farm. But no, it's I think the way we look after the land is really important, and the whole ecology around it and the wildlife that we need to support. I think we've only just realised this now. We need the wildlife to support it, rather than just blanket spray everything and then realise we haven't got any wildlife.
And is that something you've always believed? Has it always been organic, or has that kind of evolved over time?
I've always believed it, but it probably has become more ingrained, I suppose, for want of a better word. I mean, when my father started doing milling here after doing the animal feeds, organic hadn't really been invented, and
it's probably just the way food was, I think, wasn't it?
Well, we used to get this great. There used to be a local farmer who was one of the founder members of the Soil Association, and he grew this grain. It was compost grown. It was all compost grown, is what they called it, and it was just. It was a mixed farm, and it was done in the traditional way. He grew this old-fashioned variety of wheat called Maris Widgeon that had long straw, and the straw would get taken off, it would get thrashed, and that would go off to the thatchers for thatching the roofs, and we'd end up with this grain. And because it was the only farm we got it from, whatever the quality it was that year, that's what we had. And so we had a very understanding local baker who would make bread out of it. Sometimes it was better than others, but it wasn't for quite a few years until the organic grain became available, And even then, it wasn't. Quite often, there wouldn't be enough to last the whole year. It was very thin to begin with. But now we've got quite a few farms within a 30-mile radius that grow organically, so we have a good selection of grains to choose from.
Okay, that's a relief to hear, I think, isn't it? That that it's changing, and whether that's consumer driven because they want it, or whether it's just because most of the farmers I speak to genuinely love the land. They want to look after the planet. They care about animal welfare, and they almost seem to resent this kind of industrialization and this yield and this money kind of approach, and didn't ever really want to farm that way. And it's almost like it always felt wrong, and now we can prove it's wrong. We can prove the damage that it's having on the planet, and they seem desperate to kind of go back to the traditional approach if they can. But the thing that's holding them up is price and maybe supermarket pressure, and that's going to rely on the consumer to change and maybe be willing to pay a little bit more, I suppose. Is that reflective of the challenge you've had? Is the reason that you can now do this, that you can do traditional milling and you can buy organic, is because people are willing to pay more for your flour?
Yes, I think that's true. It's because we don't actually supply any supermarkets. All our trade is to small independent bakers, independent shops, farm shops, delis, and people from the door sort of thing. And it was interesting, the last recession, 2008, was it? The last recession when everything went pear-shaped for a bit, the banks gone to spot a bother, and the supermarkets just sort of took all the organic produce off the shelf overnight. So it wasn't the consumer-led, it was the decision by the supermarkets to take it up because they wanted to fill the shelves with the economy range of things, I suppose, because there wasn't going to be so much money around for purchasing. So all the organic produce got taken off. We didn't really notice any change in our output. Our demand didn't change at all, which was really interesting. So it sort of made me think really that all our customers are buying our flour because it's a choice they've made and a decision they've made, and they're quite happy staying on that course. Whereas I think with the supermarket, sometimes it can just be a trend. It can people are buying another packet on the shelf. You've got your product, whatever it might be, so whether it be flour or rice or drinking chocolate or whatever. But you've got the same big global manufacturer making it in one packet, and then next door you've got them making another packet with just organic written on, and I think that follows that sort of marketing follows a trend. Whereas those who really believe in the organic and will be buying locally and not necessarily buying from the supermarket.
Okay, that makes it sound very easy in the fact you just stick to your principles, sell organic, you charge a higher price per principle, but presumably you've been doing this a long time, so there must have been some key challenges and some shifts, I suppose, in trends that impact your business. What's been some of the key stuff over the years that comes back to you?
Yes, I suppose we started doing flour in the 1970s. So we had two types of flour. We had wholemeal flour and what we called an 81% flour. So it's like a brown flour. It's halfway between white and wholemeal. So we just produced two types of flour. And during the 70s, the supermarkets hadn't really taken a grip on the sort of whole food side of the market. So we supplied a few bakers, but a lot of our trade was to whole food shops, which were all these shops sort of popped up all over the place, selling whole foods in open bags, and you had your scoop and you weighed out what you wanted, and it was just a really nice way of doing things, really. And that carried on into the early 80s, I suppose, but the supermarkets were seeing there's a huge, because during this phase it was quite a lot of vegetarianism, and the Cranks restaurants, and they were a big scene, and so there was a huge demand for earthy foods which wasn't being covered by the supermarkets, and the supermarkets I think saw this, and so then they suddenly started stocking all the whole foods, the wholemeal flours, and a lot of these whole food shops sort of just disappeared in a very short period of time. They totally got competition was just overwhelming. So we noticed a huge drop off in the mid to late 80s. That supermarkets were really taking the trade away. It was then that I started focusing on bakers direct and channeling, finding the interesting bakers and getting them to try our flour and see if they could sort of make more interesting products. And it was quite a challenging time, sort of right up until the late 90s, really, I'd say, when a positive side of the supermarkets came through in that they were introducing the consumer to more diverse breads, and they from all over the world, well, certainly Europe, if not the world, all these sort of continental breads would appear. Okay, they weren't great, but they looked interesting. And I think before then it had just been standard British loaves, and suddenly you saw a more diverse range of breads. And I think that got people interested. So then that introduced some bakers to try and reproduce these breads better quality. So we found that a lot of the it would be chefs who'd enjoyed baking as part of their career, and really enjoyed the baking side of it, and weren't getting a bit disillusioned with the being in the kitchen bit, and they broke away and started their own bakeries, and put loads of passion into bread making, and that sort of filtered out our way. And because they like to deal with small independent miller, they like to come and see where their flour is being produced, and they like to build up the whole story. So that certainly took us late 90s through the millennium, and then the sourdough sort of revolution, for want of a better word, has taken off, and now we're finding there's a huge demand for sort of stone ground flours.
Okay, so is the current demand coming again more from the bakeries, or are you now back to the direct to the consumer again, or are the whole food shops coming back?
Not really the whole food shop. So it's more it's more small independent baker and the home baker.
Right. So how do you get direct to the consumer? Do you sell direct, or do you just go through a number of resellers?
Yes, no. It's in our locality we deliver directly to shops. But we supply one or two wholesalers, but really people out of the area, we've got an online shop, and most people would get it through that.
Nice. So the internet is providing you with a new opportunity to get straight to the caring, discerning consumer then that bypasses the super, because we're seeing this huge impact on retail, I suppose, aren't we, and the domination of the internet. And I think sometimes the concern is that's only going to play out for the benefits of the Apples and the Amazons of the world. But actually, in reality, I've spoken to a number of suppliers who say, you know what, actually it's a good thing even for the little guy, because we have now got a route to market. We can bypass the middleman. So that would be your experience in part then.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's not a huge part of our business. We don't really... Because it's quite time-consuming packing all the flour.
Yeah, absolutely. Sending half a kilo of flour.
And then you get the odd bag gets lost or whatever, and all the rest of it. So it's not something we really push, but it is becoming more of an important part of our business.
It'd be interesting once there's drones and people can just press a button and say I need flour, and it takes the hassle out of it for you. Although it would look like snow. There'll be a lot of white people going around if they start exploding. What's your thoughts on the kind of the allergy changes and the gluten-free and all the kind of stuff that's happening around that?
Yes.
Is it? Oh no, go on. I'm just going to.
Yes, again, I think there are true celiacs who can't, the slightest bit of gluten, and it does seriously affect them. And then there are those that it has become more of a fashion trend. And then there's those in between who just feel uncomfortable at eating gluten, and it just doesn't necessarily agree with them. And you wonder where all this comes from, and whether it does tend to coincide with industrial production of bread. The Chorleywood bread process, which sped up, when traditionally even yeasted bread, is left for a decent amount of time, several hours, to in bulk fermentation, so all the natural enzymes in the dough could break down the gluten. Well, this doesn't happen in mass-produced bread. They tend to use either artificial enzymes or chemicals of other description, or huge amounts of energy impacted on the dough, or combinations of all three to speed up the whole process. So the gluten's still very much there, and I don't know if you've ever chewed a bit of wheat. If you get a few bits of wheat and put them in your mouth and chew away and keep sucking the bran away, you're left with a little bit of gluten in your mouth, which is like chewing gum, and it sort of stretches and you can play about with it. And if you imagine that in your gut, it probably isn't the most digestible thing for it to be having to cope with. So, but in a dough, you've got all the enzymes helping break that down, and especially in the sourdough, even more so.
Okay. So how much of that comes from how is it how the flour is made, or how the bread is made, or is it both?
More how the bread is made.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily the, when you talk about the steel roll mills and the changes in the milling process there.
Not at all. No. I mean,
right.
Gluten's gluten. It's there in the wheat. I mean, it's there in spelt. Some people say, they avoid gluten and they eat spelt, and I have to correct them, saying there's every bit as much as gluten in spelt as there in wheat, but it's more extensible. It's a weaker gluten, and so it stretches, so it is more digestible to the gut. So some people who find they can eat spelt products, whereas with wheat products they do find it difficult to digest.
Okay, but the same rule applies really. Is the fact that they can get away with making the bread in it quicker because the spelt is easier to break down the gluten. Whereas really, if we were just still making bread in the traditional way, which presumably a lot of the people you supply and the local bakers that you supply would be making the bread in the way that would break down the gluten in advance, and therefore potentially wouldn't affect people in the same way as.
Well, that's right. Yes, I mean, if you go to your independent baker, there's a good chance that it is a long fermentation process. Even with yeasted dough, it could be at least 4 hours, and you get this breakdown.
Yeah, I know my chefs get frustrated, and you're absolutely right. There is definitely a case for celiac, and we make a lot more gluten-free products. And actually, a lot of the time now, the bakers are learning how to make gluten-free in a way that doesn't have an impact on quality and taste. But I still feel that it's an overreaction, and if we just got back to the whole food and back as close to the grain as possible, and some of the traditional techniques, that would be for me a nicer solution.
Definitely, yes, and certainly on the industrially produced gluten-free products. I mean, if you read through the ingredients on them, it's quite shocking, and the amount of processing aids and sugars and fats that are required to replicate what the product has if you just use natural ingredients, which these added ingredients must be far, far worse for you than.
It's incomprehensible. I think. People think they're doing it for a health reason.
Yes.
Yeah, and then you go, do you realise what's actually in it? When, like you say, gluten is completely natural and from the grain. I think the more we can get back to a whole food diet and a less processed diet. But it's been encouraging, and it was the same when I was chatting to Helen from the Soil Association, because part of me was concerned that it was going to be impossible to follow a more traditional approach to farming or anywhere along this process of food production, and to feed 10 billion people by 2050 was actually a juxtaposition. It was actually impossible to achieve both. But she was actually very optimistic that you can you can increase yields and you can farm traditionally, and it is possible to feed the population. We just need to be, a little bit more clever. And there's a lot of research now around, agroforestry and kind of, mixing the diversity of what you grow and how you grow. So it seems that, we're not in this position because we don't have to compromise to feed people. In essence, we can still feed people really good food. We've got the consumer to want it, and we've got the supply to be there. Would that seem fair from your experience?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it probably is always going to be more expensive. So it's going to be that those with less disposable income, those who are on a tight household budget, that are less likely to be able to afford, which seems a bit unfair in a lot of respects, because why should they miss out on having a healthy, nutritious diet? But there's a whole educational raft to break through too, I think, that needs to come right.
Well, all food once upon a time would have been healthy and nutritious. Yeah. So who was it who made the decision that it was okay to get rid of healthy, nutritious food to make it cheaper? We all used to eat normal food, didn't we?
Yeah.
But back when we were way more skint than we were now, it's a very easy thing to say, because obviously there's a lot of people in the economy that would struggle. But it's where it's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of situation. As where did the problem come from? It feels like we should be able to feed the population nutritious food without, bankrupting people.
I suppose we've devalued food, haven't we? I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we were spending sort of 20, 30, 40% of our income on food, and now is it down to about 6% now or something? It has been really devalued, and it's more important to have the car and the conservatory and the computer.
That's the thing, And how did what we put in our bodies become, so much further down the list? It seems insane. I've said this before, but I get asked more questions around nutrition when I take my dog to the vet about, is the dog's diet changed? What's he eating? What's he doing? Than I do when I go to the doctors myself. I don't think I've ever been asked, have you changed your diet? Have you changed what you eat? What are you actually, what are you putting in your body? And it seems, it seems odd that nutrition just doesn't seem to be part of what we're. I suppose it comes down to education, I guess. We're not taught about it at a young enough age to understand it.
And if we improved our diets and were more healthy, that would save the NHS thing. It's a whole cycle, isn't it?
And it would help the planet be better, because we'd be growing food in a way that was better. So
it's a no-brainer, but it's just breaking the cycle.
But I hope it's changing. So I was I'm not pessimistic about it, just concerned about it. That's part of the reason for launching this podcast, was at least have the conversations. I don't think people aren't consciously making the wrong decisions. I think, it's either subconsciously or because we're simply not aware, basically. So the more we have the conversation, the more we talk about it. And I do think the way that information is now transmitted is no longer just sort of top down from the government, but there's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of documentaries through social media, through, being able to sell directly to the consumer, you being able to get your message out now, bypassing the supermarket. So I do think there's there's a genuinely good and interesting opportunity at the moment, but it's not going to be instantaneous.
No, I think that's correct.
In the process of doing this, does it feel overwhelming, kind of, running this business in this kind of niche? Is this something you genuinely have a passion for and you genuinely love, or do you look out and see the changes and the new milling techniques and what the supermarket's doing and kind of lose faith, or actually does it just kind of motivate you more to get up every day and fight that battle?
I really enjoy what I'm doing, and yes, there are always challenges every day, and I think yes, I'm not. I'm not tempted to go to the other side. No, I'm quite happy milling in the traditional way, but there are loads of improvements. I'd like to do. I can see we can do here. So it's a constant challenge trying to do the best here, really.
Yeah. So going back a little bit to that idea that maybe there is going to be an increase in demand, and actually it's quite hard to supply it because there's so few mills, if people want to get into milling, is this you kind of think of barriers to entry, I suppose, in the fact that most mills you see are very traditional, have been there for hundreds of years. If somebody just goes, you know what, I want to do that, is it possible? Can you set up these kind of new mills? What advice would you give to a wannabe kind of person who goes, yeah, I want to do milling? Is it how's this kind of career, your kind of traditional approach, how's that going to continue for the next 5 generations?
So if you want to be a water miller or a windmiller, you are restricted to finding a water miller or a windmill, right, which are sort of few and far between. But there are ones dotted around the country, and it's important to breathe life into them, to preserve them, to give them reason to carry on working. So that's a good reason in itself to keep them working. We supply 1 or 2 bakers that actually mill some of their own flour. They've installed milling equipment into their bakery, so it gets very quite low output, but it's just enough for them to produce what they want to produce.
That's interesting. So it is possible then to just mill on a smaller level. Again, getting back to that, so like you say, there would have been once upon a time there'd have been mill in every village. Yeah. So we're not going to go back to that, but people can do this on a smaller scale.
Yeah, there are farms. Some farms have installed their own milling equipment, so they're adding value onto their own crops. Okay. Milling their own crops.
But do they tend to instill the very modern approach to milling, or the more traditional in your experience?
It tends to be stones. Yeah. Yes, okay. Yes.
That's good.
Yes, no.
It just feels a shame to lose this, this kind of heritage and this ability to get that genuinely nutritious kind of product. It would be a shame to lose that in only a few generations. I don't know, so going back to the craft brewery kind of analogy, but there were literally thousands. And presumably that would have been the same with mills. There would have been thousands, and now it sounded like there were maybe 30. That's a bit.
Yeah. And I suppose it's the same with the traditional baker, isn't it? The bakers dotted around. Yeah. And, but I think there are more bakers beginning to appear, so that's very encouraging.
Okay, so you're optimistic. So what's next for Stoates then? Have you got any plans?
Just do what we do better, I think. Yes, build up relationship with our farms, and it's nice having the relationship we do have with our farmers we buy the grain from, so work on that, and also relationship with the bakers too. It's nice having the whole cycle, really, seeing the grain growing in the fields, coming in, and then when you deliver around to the bakers, you see them pulling the loaves of bread out of the oven. So that I do find really satisfying.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Yeah, I love it. So if people want to find out more and they want to buy your products, where's the best place for them to go?
I suppose, like a lot of things these days, first port of call is the website. Yeah. So stoatesflour.co.uk, and that we'll be able to find a list of stockists, all about what we do, and some of the bakers we supply.
Perfect. You on social media as well? Or?
We're not actually, no.
Brilliant, good. Thank you for being one of the few left that's not. I love coming out to the British countryside.
Supermarkets.
Yeah, you don't, and you're not on social media, which is a good thing, because I think that's it's all about genuine authenticity and getting back to traditional ways, I think, isn't it? And not getting lost in all of that. It'd drive you bonkers, all the celiacs on Instagram. You'd be pulling your hair out. You're much better off. Well, look, thank you for doing what you do. Thanks for keeping the traditional mills alive, and for such a great product. I know my bakers have used it for a number of years, and I said I'll go back and check if we still are. But it's a great product. It's a great story. Thanks for doing it in the first instance, and thanks for sparing the time to chat about it. It's fascinating.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Cheers. So there you have it. You have reached the end of another episode of the Humans of Hospitality podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please go and visit our website, humansofhospitality.co.uk, for the show notes and extra episodes and information. And whilst you're there, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter and to receive free materials all about the humans behind our incredible industry. Lastly, if you could subscribe, rate and review this podcast, you will be massively helping me out, and it would be hugely appreciated. Thank you so much. We'll be launching another podcast in just 7 days' time. Cheers.